Awesome. All right, are we in? We're on. Nice. Ah, man, this is so weird. I miss you guys. Hope everything's doing well. You probably saw my my little announcement on Canvas yesterday. I've gotten quite a few assignments from before the midterm, but not everybody's. Kind of broke my heart to put in so many failing grades, and the reason they were failing grades, not that you haven't been doing any work, but just there's so little being done right now that the one assignment can make the difference between a failing grade and a passing grade. So if you are missing something, be that the Colorize project or the portfolio project, get those in. I need those. I will still give it to you for full credit too. Even if you hand it to me, the last day I'm taking grades. If you give that to me the last day I'm taking grades, I will still give that for full credit. So I want you to be at ease. Sometimes people are like, oh my gosh, maybe I shouldn't hand it in at all, right? Because I missed it. No, hand it in. Today I wanted to talk to you about a new assignment. So just to recap, if you haven't turned in your Colorize project, or remember, if you don't have access to Photoshop at home, then you're doing an alternative assignment, Humans of Salt Lake, very similar to Humans of New York. If you haven't seen that, you just give me three different posts. They could be just people in your house, and if you don't have 3 people in your house, then take one of yourself, one of whoever you're living with, and your dog, whatever, right? I want to see those posts. I think they're going to turn out awesome. If you have access to Photoshop, then instead do the Colorize project. And I've seen some incredible ones. The majority of people have handed in the Colorize project, and they've turned out so good. They've turned out super, super good. So I'm proud of what you do, and I want to help you through this. I want to help you guys figure out what you need to hand in, and hopefully just a little bit of motivation too. Like, I don't want to hang a grade over your head, but maybe this could be the motivation. I have found photography, really any kind of media, video, photography, to be sort of an outlet in my life. One of the ways that I have been kind of staying sane in this time is that I've been making videos, right? I've been almost daily making videos. I get busy doing other stuff. It's like during this time, everybody thinks, oh, well, they're not doing anything, so they all take your time, and then suddenly you don't have any time. I've found that I have very little time lately, but I do want to dedicate some of that time to hobbies and crafts and projects and things I love. And one of the things I absolutely love is making video. So I do those things that I usually do, but I make a video along the way. I hope that photography is an outlet for you, right? Stay sane throughout this crazy time by doing the things you love, and hopefully you discover a real love, a real passion for photography. Somebody in their portfolio projects, they've already submitted their portfolio, and they said, I love photography through these projects, not just the portfolio, but just through this class. I really discovered how much I absolutely love photography. I want to just kind of dedicate myself to it and really discover the potential of photography in my life. They were like, well, maybe I could make money at it. And just throughout your life, especially in this crazy time, hopefully you can find this passion in photography. Now, I get it. Not everyone's going to be a paid commercial photographer, right? Not everyone's going to, do weddings and portraits and make money at this. But I hope at least that you can find this to be, a hobby, something to pass the time, especially in this crazy time where it's like, okay, do I, sit and be sad, or do I play video games, or do I, how do I pass the time? Maybe that thing that you can do to pass the time is going to be photography. And I think that could be awesome. I wanted to jump into this new project. So again, if you haven't done the portfolio, do the portfolio first. The due date for this one is later on. And like I said, the due dates are more just checkpoints. If you do end up missing the checkpoint, if you're not first place, that's fine, right? I'll still take it. I'm just saying, if you want to stay on pace, on target, then do this one. I have it in Canvas right now. Let's switch it over to Canvas. I have it as May 13th. So if you're interested in handing this in on the due date of this one, May 13th. And you also saw probably in that post that I put up, the Canvas assignment, that I'm not going to give you things after a certain point. And I think even the district is making it a policy that after a certain point, and I think it's that date actually, the week of the 12th through whatever, you can check your calendar, I forget what it is. It's that full week, let's see, May 11th through 15th, right? That's the last week to be handing things in. That's a district policy. Excuse me, not handing things in, assigning new things, right? And then for that week and the last week of school, that's the time for kids to hustle and get things finished. So if you are missing things, get that done. And I'm setting the due date of this one as May 13th. I'm going to assess as we go through if there's going to be another one. It may just be this. I told you in that announcement, I'm sort of backing off a little bit from the rigor of my assignments, just simply because I want our assignments to be really meaningful and hit those points that I want to hit. But at the same time, I don't want to like overwhelm you and stress you out. I want to do those exact same tenets, those same proficiencies, if you want to use that word, without just inundating you with assignments, right? Like I'm sure some of your teachers are. So I want to try to avoid that. Today, what I want to go over is something that in a normal time frame where we're like in class and working each day and stuff, we probably would have gone over already. In fact, kind of right at the beginning of fourth quarter, we would have hit all this already. So you would have been a pro at metering. But I want to hit metering now so that you understand how it works and how you can apply it to your photography. So let's get into it. All right. So metering. Metering's a really interesting one. It's very similar to what we've learned already, right? Metering sounds like exposure. We've done metering before, where you meter for the right amount of light. You let the right amount of light into your camera, and then you take the picture, and it looks great, right? But you've probably also had some times where when you took the picture, it didn't exactly turn out the way that you thought it would, right? Haven't there been times when you thought you'd take just a beautiful picture and, maybe because of the bright sky, it turned out too dark, or because it was on the beach or something, right? You thought it was going to turn out great because you faithfully followed your meter, right? You got your meter right exactly in the middle, so you were faithfully following what your camera said. And yet, when you took the picture, it actually turned out either too light or too dark from what you wanted it to be visually, right? Ultimately, you're the one that says, oh, this is a good photo or this isn't a good photo. And you can kind of go against your camera's best wishes. You can go higher up on the meter or lower on the meter on purpose, right? So let's get into this. Seeing the light. Without light, you can't make photographs. Well, duh, right? Without light, you couldn't see anything. In this profession, light is everything. As young professionals, you need to understand the following attributes. First, the camera sees light differently than the human eye sees light. Boy, isn't that true? You've probably seen that, right? I gave the example before where in a dark room, but with a window, like when the lights are off, you can see what's going on in the dark room, but you can also see what's going on outside in that bright light, because your eye can do that. Your eye has a very high dynamic range, HDR, high dynamic range. You've probably heard that. Your iPhone can do that. But a camera has a lot more limited dynamic range, right? Your camera can go a certain number of stops from dark to light, and if you push toward the light end, you might not see very much detail in the dark, and vice versa, right? So you need to sort of kind of understand how that works, so that you can sort of visualize what that's going to look like even before you take the picture. And yeah, it takes time, it takes practice, some trial and error. You'll take a bunch of pictures and go, man, why did that turn out bad? I followed the meter, what the heck? It's something that you need to start understanding over time. And you need to also understand how your camera talks to you. Wait a minute, your camera talks to you? Yeah. Yeah, we've talked about that, where you hold your shutter button halfway down and the meter comes and tells you whether you're underexposed or overexposed right there on the meter. So inside your camera, there's a little device called a meter, and it measures the amount of light coming into the camera per your settings, right? So it takes into account your shutter speed, your aperture, takes into account your ISO, and then it calculates how bright or how dark your photo is going to be, even before you take the photo, based on how much light is coming in. So it takes an average of the light tones and the dark tones, the highlights, the shadows, the whites, the blacks, and mixes it all together, takes an average, right? Pushes that and looks at it right up against your settings and say, okay, against your settings, mathematically, this is going to be overexposed or this is going to be underexposed, just based on your settings. And what it's looking for is that middle. We call that average gray or medium gray. Most of the time, we just call it 18% gray, right? That middle gray is exactly right in the middle of that scale, and all meters are standardized to that 18% gray. They're all looking for that gray. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, why isn't it 50% gray? Because 50% is in the middle. Well, actually, on the light scale is more exponential. It's actually logarithmic. So it's tipped on its side. But essentially, there is no pure black. Pure black, 0%, would just be blindness. The closest we have ever gotten to pure black is Vanta black. Actually, I think there's a better one now. And then, pure white, we'd all go blind because it's super bright. There's a spectrum that your eye can see. Well, in this case right here, there's a spectrum that your camera can see. And right smack dab in the middle of that is 18% gray. So it's always looking for that 18% gray, the mixture of all of your, all the light coming in. And you've seen that before on your meter. When you hold your shutter button halfway down, it tells you, if you're toward the plus side, it's going, hey, you know what? You're letting too much light in. So how do you remedy that? Either you speed up your shutter speed, or you can close down your F number, your aperture, or you can make your camera less sensitive in the first place with your ISO, right? So you go to the lower number with your ISO. But let's say that your camera is more to the minus side, right? It's pushed over to the minus side. Well, that means that not enough light is getting let in, okay? Either you need to increase your ISO, or you need to slow down your shutter speed, right? Or you need to open your aperture wider. Okay, well, you've probably taken a photo that when you took it, your meter was right in the middle, right? Your meter was happy. It says, hey, I'm right here on right on the zero, right on the middle. But when you took the picture, it turned out too dark or even too light, and you think, well, wait a minute, I followed the meter. I'm being faithful to my camera. I want to introduce a new topic that may help you remedy that, and that's what we call metering modes. And metering modes are very interesting. Metering modes are where your camera takes that average from. So remember, when you hold your shutter button halfway down, your camera is taking an average of where of all of the light tones, the dark tones, the mids, the grays, everything, right? And it takes an average and says, okay, from the corners, from the midpoint, from everywhere, mix all that together, and that average should be 18% gray. Okay, but what if you don't want to take into account the edges, the corners? You just want to take into account kind of that middle zone. Or maybe you want to get real specific and you only want to target one single exact point, right? So that's when you would change your metering mode. I bet right now, if you were to look at your metering modes on your camera, it's in the settings. Some cameras it's in the quick menus, but it's most often in the settings in the menu. I bet most often if I were to ask you what setting it's in, it's probably in the one that takes an average from everywhere. And that one actually has a couple different names. It goes by either matrix metering, that's on a Nikon camera, evaluative metering, that's on a Canon camera, and then multi-metering or multi-segmented metering, that's on a Sony camera, I believe. But you'll see it on all different names. It's crazy. So that takes the average from everywhere in the picture, right? It's measuring the lights and darks from the middle, from the outer zone, from the top, the bottom, the corners, the edges, the sides, everywhere, right? So if there's a lot of dark on one side, light on the other, they kind of balance each other out, right? It's trying to push toward that middle gray. So it takes into account the bright things. It takes into account the dark things from everywhere in the picture, right? But what if you don't want to take into account how super dark the edge is, right? What if you just kind of want a middle zone? You know, that's when you'd go to center weighted metering. You can think of it as kind of like it mostly takes the average from the middle and then it sort of tapers off to the ends. So by the time you get to this, outer zone, this outer edge, it's not really taking that into account. So if there is something really dark or something light, it doesn't pull down the average. It doesn't change the average because it's not taking that into consideration. It's really just focused on kind of that middle zone, right? So that's center weighted metering. Center weighted is great for when you have some obvious middle subject, right? So I go to center weighted metering quite often, say for portraits and things. We'll get into what they're used for in just a sec. So then there's spot metering, and you think, okay, well, what would you use spot metering for? That's when you would use that's when you would take a picture of like one thing that is the most important, that maybe is a different tone than everything else. Say you've got a really light subject on a super dark background. Okay, great time to use spot metering, or vice versa. You got it the other way, where you don't want to bring up the average or bring down the average with everything around it. You really just want to focus on that one middle zone. That's when you'd go to spot metering, right? Awesome. So when would each of these be used, right? When you're in matrix metering, remember that one is also called evaluative metering on a Canon camera, or you might also hear that be called multimetering on some other cameras. I think Sony is the one that calls it multimetering. When you're in matrix metering, that is when you would kind of the most often used. It's the default. So I bet your camera right now, if you were to look at your settings, is probably in matrix metering or evaluative metering. That's for just kind of average scenes where the light doesn't change a ton from the foreground to the background. The light on the middle is the same light as on the corners and stuff. So the light's basically all the same. Great for just kind of general outdoor pictures where there's not like a super bright sunlight or there's not like a bright sky. It's just like I'm out taking pictures, we're having fun with friends, things like that. You're not trying to get fancy with the spices or anything. You're just taking an average old picture. That's probably, most of the time you're going to stay in matrix metering, aka evaluative metering. The next one, center weighted. I would switch to center weighted metering when there's that one middle subject that is the most important. Think like a portrait, right? Whether the background is lighter or darker, it really doesn't matter. All you care about is getting the light from that middle portrait looking really good, right? So that's when I would go to center weighted. Any backlit scene where the light is great on the subject, but it's even brighter on the back, or even opposite that, where you've got a darker subject and there's a lot of light, there's a lighter subject but a lot of dark going on behind. You don't care about the light from behind. You really just want the light looking great. You want to meter correctly for that middle subject. Okay, that's when I'd go to center weighted. Spot metering, spot's an interesting one. That's kind of for your special cases, where anytime your camera might get fooled. For example, if you've got a light subject on a dark background or a dark subject on a light background, right? A silhouette, you're trying to take a silhouette shot. Say you've got someone in shadow, right? Say you're taking pictures of someone in the commons, right, here at school. And the light from inside is fairly dark compared to how much light is coming on outside. So if you were to take that picture in matrix metering or evaluative metering, it would take the light from everywhere. So you'd see the dark subject, and that would bring down the average, but then most of the picture is this enormously bright background, and it would go, whoa, that's so bright, turn it down. So then inevitably what you'd get is probably way too dark because it wanted to compensate for how intensely bright the background is, and then your subject just turns way dark, right? So to avoid that, you might be in spot metering, where you would hold the shutter button halfway down in spot metering, and it's not taking the average from anywhere except for that one person, that one single spot. I think on Nikon's website they said that the spot in spot metering is representative of like 3 degrees of the 360 degrees that we actually see. So it's very, very like laser focused on one single spot. Now, there are meters that are inside your camera. There are also external meters. Those are called incident meters, sometimes called handheld meters. You might have seen one of those if you go to a professional portrait studio, right? And it has this goofy like ping pong ball thing on the top. And it actually gives you a reading directly from the light, right? That's why it's called incident, because it's not reflected off the subject. It is directly at the meter, so it's incident to the meter. And it actually gives you a reading as an F number, you know, like how an aperture is measured as an F number. And that can tell you right there on the spot how much light is coming off of each light source. So you can get like very accurate lighting as a result of following that meter. It's very cool, very cool. There's also the in-camera meter, and like I just barely said, those are reflective meters. So let me, I have a little diagram to show you. So that first one, like I said, like a handheld meter, okay, that's called an incident reading. It's incident to the light. So the light is directly coming onto the meter itself. It's not being reflected and then hitting the meter. So it's like laser accurate. You can get super accurate light readings because it's directly from the source. It's not bouncing off of something and then getting a reading. That's like those handheld meters. It measures the light directly falling onto the subject, and it's not affected by high contrast backgrounds because it's not even taking the light from the background. It's only taking the light directly from the light source. So you'll see that often in a professional studio. Then, of course, there's reflected readings, right? The reflected light coming off of a subject, or excuse me, coming off from light source, bouncing off of a subject, and then going through the meter, right? And then the meter will tell you how much light came off of that subject because it was reflected off of it. And that can be tricky. It works well for average scenes, right, where the tones are distributed evenly. But the problem is once you start getting into a high contrast situation where you have, say, a light subject on a dark background or dark subject on a light background, you end up sort of getting, your camera can easily get fooled, right? Because it's looking at it going, you know, oh, I need to take an average of everything, the light, the dark, the middle, the mid-tones, everything all mixed together. And it can make for a little bit of an odd, you know, an odd reading because it is taking into account, say, you know, the bright sky, but you want the, you know, the ground plane to look great. Well, the ground plane's a lot darker. Or the beach or snow, right? Those are highly reflective and they bounce into the camera. So your camera's reading a very high reading, but actually it should be kind of lower, right? So, you know, here's an example of that. Here's a meter fooled by some bright skies, beautiful bright sky, and when they wanted to take a picture of this epic cloud, they held the shutter button halfway down in evaluative metering, and, you know, it says, oh, well, you know, there's a dark cloud and a dark ground plane, but holy cow, look how amazingly intensely bright this sky is, right? So dark plus super, super light, the camera's meter went, whoa, you got to turn all that down, right? So they probably sped up their shutter speed, closed down the aperture, and then they ended up with this, this photo that visually is too dark, right? Now the meter was probably happy, right? Because super light plus middle gray plus dark equals 18% gray. It's probably right in the middle. So the meter was happy, but visually it's too dark, right? So you might think, well, let's switch that then. You know, let's aim at something that's darker, right? I'll hold my shutter button halfway down on this cloud because the cloud is gray anyway, right? So, you know, you end up maybe getting the meter from this one and it's not taking this into account. So it might say, oh, you know, to get this cloud to look good, actually you need to slow it down or you need to open up the aperture, whatever you need to do so that your settings are right in the middle, aimed for the cloud. So then you take that picture, the cloud looks great, but then look, the sky is way too bright. So sometimes evaluative metering or matrix metering, depending on your camera brand, that might not be the option that you need, right? Sometimes you need to be in a different metering mode. And honestly, sometimes you just need to go against the best wishes of your camera, right? Sometimes you just need to, when you take that picture, you're like, okay, well, I know you're saying that it's right in the middle, but I know that when I'm about to take this photo, it's probably going to be underexposed, right? Because there's so much light coming off this sky. I know I need to fix this and change my settings so that it looks better. So here's the the sunflowers on a bright sky. It's too bright. So there's some kind of happy medium in between, right? And I think, sometimes it is going against the best wishes of your meter, where you're not going right in the middle. Maybe there is some medium between this is too dark, this is clearly too light. There's something in the middle where you can make it right. And sometimes it's getting it as close as you can. Maybe you started with this one, you love this one, but you shot in RAW so you can fix it later, and you boost the shadow tones and turn down the highlights, and you end up almost with like an HDR, a high dynamic range. There is also a way, this is completely an aside, but there's a way that you can take 2 or more photos, sometimes 3 photos or more, and kind of stitch them together. And that is actually called HDR, high dynamic range. It's kind of a cool one if you wanted to try that out, but that's completely separate. I'm getting off topic. But it's easier to not get off topic when there's not kids in my room. That's what I've noticed. All right, so we've seen that. Let's just do a quick little review, right? Exposure. You guys have heard exposure, but just to remind us, exposure is the total amount of light used to render an image on a light-sensitive medium, basically how much light comes into your camera. And you've heard those two terms, overexposed and underexposed. Overexposed means too much light got let into your camera, right? Underexposed means not enough light got let into your camera. And you've seen what that looks like on pictures, but you've also seen it in your meter too. You've seen it so that not enough light got let in and all that. You've seen underexposed photos where not enough light got let in and the dark tones just turn way too dark, right? You've also seen overexposed where the dark tones are almost like too detailed, and then the light tones just turn way too bright, So there is some kind of happy medium where you have a proper exposure, and that's maybe increasing one of your settings or turning it down. Let's get into that. Exposure is comprised of 2 major elements, the intensity of the light, meaning how bright, and the duration of the light, meaning how long, right? That's the shutter speed in the aperture. But you also know there's a third one too, right? That's the sensitivity of your light in the ISO. But you guys remember from when we talked about exposure that I don't like to think of them as 3 equals. Right? I don't like to think of it as the exposure triangle. Some people will probably get real mad at me if they see this public streamed video and they say, well, you don't teach the exposure triangle. No, I don't, because the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture are 3 very separate and different elements to the exposure. So we can't just say, oh, well, if you turn up the shutter speed, then you have to down the ISO. No. You do the ISO first, right? We talked about this, set it and forget it. I should make a whole separate video about that to remind you how to do that. But remember, you do the ISO first, and then here are these other 2, the intensity and the duration. The intensity, of course, is the aperture, how bright, basically how wide do you let the window open, and then the duration, right? The duration is what length of time is the camera open to the light. Most often it's in a quick fraction of a second. So those 2 elements are complements of each other. They're not opposite each other. Think of them more as complements of each other. If you understand kind of the balance between those and the ISO, you understand the balance of those 3 variables and how they complement each other, and you can make some amazing photos. So think of exposure as this metaphor. The intensity of duration, the intensity and duration of light can be thought of as similar to water flowing into a bucket. All the while, we're trying to fill the bucket with a gallon of water, right? The capacity, all the while, is 1 gallon. So if you use a small pipe, right, a thin diameter of a pipe, think the intensity being lower, it will take a longer time, right, longer duration to fill the bucket. All right, well, that makes sense, yeah. But let's think the opposite, right? If you have a larger, wider pipe, right, say you open the aperture wider to the lower number, the lower F number, the water can gush in a whole lot faster. So greater intensity, shorter duration, right? So that makes it so that the duration is a whole lot shorter. All the while, though, remember, it's a gallon of water. So going back to what this means in photography, all the while we're looking for that 18% gray. And you can get that amount of light to come into the camera either by a long time, but with a really closed down window, right? So a high aperture number, high F number, and a longer time. Or you can have it with a wide aperture with a very short duration, short shutter speed, right? Either one could produce a really great photo, but that, it's a different way of thinking about it, whether you have a slow time or a fast time, and then, compensating for that by the aperture. So how to control those, right? So the aperture, the F number, here's that F right there. It's usually like this little cursive F. F-stops, they control the intensity of the light going through the lens by opening and closing that aperture. And I've showed you that before. It's like an actual window. It's a part of the lens that opens and closes. I wonder if I can, this is a manual aperture. I wonder if I can show this. Shout out to Patrick for donating this one to my archive. I love, if you have any like old broken camera equipment or something, then I'm happy to take it. Okay, so can you see that? Yeah, you can see that. Sweet. So this is the aperture of the lens. Now you're actually seeing it through a couple of other pieces of glass, so it looks like a smaller opening. It looks like it only opens like a centimeter, right? But if I were to take this whole housing apart, I'm tempted to take this housing apart so you can actually see. But if I were to open this, open and closed, this actually probably opens about an inch. Maybe not that big, probably like a ½ inch. Right? It goes pretty far open. It's surprising. So that's the aperture. It's like these fan blades that cover over each other, and I've shown you pictures of that in the exposure lecture too, so hopefully you remember that. The F number is a ratio between the focal length of the lens and the diameter of the aperture. That's where the F comes from. And each whole number change, we call those stops. Right? So yeah, you might have some in-betweens. My camera goes to f3.5. It goes to f7. It goes to, there's some in-betweener numbers. But generally, these big round, well, they're not round. They're fractions, some of them. Those are, every time you go to one of those main points, not the in-betweeners, but the main points, f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, and so on, that is a factor of 2, meaning you're letting in, going this direction, you're letting in half as much light, half as much light, half as much light going this way. And then opening the window, going to the left, you're letting in twice as much light, twice as much light, twice as much light. So, you can see after a while, as you do those clicks on the dial, you're actually letting in substantially more light each time, quite a bit. So that's the f-stops, the aperture. But you also know that the other one is the duration, the shutter time, right? Modern electronic shutters allow these increments, right? There's not usually an in-between between them. Shutter speeds, you can think of them as fractions of a second, unless you see the slower ones that are usually measured as, in the seconds, not as fractions of a second. And you'll see that with a quotation mark. So like 2 quotation mark means 2 seconds. 10 quotation mark is 10 seconds, right? And you might notice, right, they are pretty standardized. There's not going to be kind of an in-between of these, but you might notice, well, sometimes there are, right? There's 1/60th, and then there's also 1/80th of a second on my camera, and then 1/100th of a second. So they kind of, the increments in between go in thirds, I think. But as you go faster and faster on these main numbers, right, you're letting in half as much light going faster, or twice as much light going the opposite direction, going slower. So like, yeah, you can kind of see that, right? 1 second, half of that is half of that is a quarter, half of that is an eighth, half of that is a 15th, close enough. 15 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 to 125, close enough. Right, you get what I mean? So the reason that there's kind of these weird bumps in increments is that's an attempt to combine some old standards for shutter speeds, right? Back in the day, it was in hunks of fractions of a second. It was half second, quarter second, even longer than that in the whole seconds. And then shutter times could get faster, right? So then they thought, oh, you know, like 30, 60, like a clock, you know, and then, you know, even faster, like mathematically, scientifically faster. My camera goes to 1/4000th of a second. Some cameras go to, actually I do have one that goes to 1/8000th of a second, super fast, right? Like scientifically fast. Most of the time you don't need that unless you're shooting super bright or you're shooting added light, so you can get like a frozen, super frozen shutter speed kind of thing. But you guys know, right, the combination of the aperture with the shutter speed will give you the right amount of light, balancing for your meter, right? You don't really need to know this. This is just interesting. This is the rule of equivalent exposures. Say you've got, you know, a really good combination at, you know, f8 and then 1/15th of a second, right? And like that lets in the right amount of light, but man, that's such a slow shutter speed. Could I speed this up? Let's say I went like 1, 2, 3 stops with the shutter speed. Could I also go 1, 2, 3 stops with the aperture, right? So basically that's the idea. If I started with, you know, this combination, I'm not saying this is always the way, like this is the perfect exposure all the time. These shift and slide around depending on how much light there is. But say this is a good combination for whatever photo I'm taking. If I count how many, right, if I go say 1, 2, 3, 4 stops with the shutter speed, faster with the shutter speed, well, that means I could go 1, 2, 3 stops with the aperture and let the same amount of light in, right? Exact same amount of light, just, you know, just letting, changing those two variables. Try that sometime. If you have a really good combination between the aperture and the shutter speed, try going, you know, wherever you're at with the aperture or the shutter speed, go, you know, count how many clicks you do on the dial. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, I did 5 clicks with the shutter speed. Go in the opposite direction, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with the aperture, and you'll see that it lets in the exact same amount of light. Okay, case in point, here's those goofy photos that I took for the exposure project. I had a lot of fun taking these in my garage a couple of years ago. You know, here's the combination of the shutter speed, super fast shutter speed with a wide open aperture. Okay, and then as I continue, right, here's f22, so super closed down, and now a slower shutter speed, right? All the while, these are all the exact same amount of light. Sure, the depth of field changed, but the amount of light stayed the same. I go down with the shutter speed, up with the aperture, and vice versa, right? Cool. So to get the correct amount of exposure, to get the correct exposure for digital cameras, you must properly meter for the light at the scene. You can't just like aim down at your... Sometimes I'll see when people are metering, they're like looking down at the floor, and I'm like, you're taking pictures of that, right? If you aim down at the floor, guess what you're metering for? The floor, right? So it's going to probably tell you that it's too dark or something. You have to aim at the scene. You have to actually look at what you're pointing at, or else your numbers are going to be wrong, right? Your meter reading is going to be wrong. So this involves pointing your camera at the subject, activating the meter, meaning holding your shutter button halfway down, and then correcting your exposure, right? If it tells you toward the plus side, well, that means too much light is getting let in, so you either need to down the ISO, speed up the shutter speed, right? Or close down the aperture. You need to let in less light. But sometimes it's toward the minus side, right? Not enough light is getting let in. So you need to either make your camera more sensitive with the ISO, or you need to slow down your shutter speed, or you need to widen your aperture. One of those three variables, or a couple of those, a combination of those, and that'll give you the right amount of light. But you also know, right, there are times when your camera's fooled, right? Your camera is looking at a subject, maybe there's a light subject on a dark background or vice versa, and it just doesn't quite fit, right? It doesn't work. What's going on there? You take the picture and it turned out darker than you thought. You were following the meter. You were exactly in the middle on your meter, and yet the picture visually looks either too dark or too light. How do you remedy that? That's when you come in with those metering modes, right? So your DSLR, most point and shoot cameras, and I'd say all mirrorless cameras too are going to have this. Take a look at your individual camera. And if you're not sure where they are, you can look in your camera's manual. I could even just Google it real quick, just look up your camera. It's a Sony whatever, A something. Type that in, plus metering modes at the end. And there's probably either a video or a picture or a product review or something that shows you exactly how to get to the metering modes. So, remember, there's basically usually 3 different metering modes. Some cameras will have 4 different metering modes. Canon cameras will also have one that's called, I think, pattern. Yeah, pattern metering. No, partial metering. So partial metering is very similar. It's kind of the in-between of center-weighted and spot metering. It's kind of like a smart middle. But if you don't have that, don't worry about it. For the project that we're about to do, we won't even use that metering mode, so don't even worry about it. Anyway, so matrix metering, center-weighted metering, spot metering, those are the 3. And remember, matrix metering comes by a couple different names. You might hear it as evaluative metering. If you're on a Canon camera, multi-segmented, you're going to see it as all different names. So just know that that's the one that takes the average from everywhere, from the middle, from the outer zone, from the corners, from the edges, everywhere. So if you've got something in the background that's darker than your subject, it might pull down the average, right, and tell you to make your photo more bright. Well, visually that doesn't work, right? So your camera's getting fooled by something super bright or super dark in the background because in matrix metering, it's taking that average from everywhere. Okay? The next one is center weighted, right? You're taking the average of how much light is coming in just kind of from that middle zone, right? And it tapers off to the ends. There's a gradient, and by the time you get to the edges, you can't hardly even see, or it doesn't even take into account how bright or how dark the background is. Okay, and then there's spot metering, and we'll get into spot metering in just a sec on how important spot metering is. It really just takes the average from one single point, not from the edges, not from the corners, just from that one middle zone. And by the way, you can move that zone too. It's going to stay in the middle of the camera, but that just means you physically move the camera over to a different point. Get the meter reading right, and then compose your image to somewhere else, right? So say like it's off-centered. Okay, well, meter for the thing that's off-centered, get the meter reading right, and then compose your image to push that thing off-centered again, right? So some people might think, well, shoot, isn't that the answer for all of this then? Should we be in spot metering just all the time? No, you should not. We're going to see some examples where it's really, really important to be in spot metering. But if you're in spot metering all the time, you're going to feel like your camera is like schizophrenic, bipolar. You'll watch your meter just bounce all over the place. You'll look at something slightly darker, and your meter will go zoom way over to the minus side. You push it over to the plus, to something lighter, and it'll whoosh, push over to the plus side really fast. So you're going to feel like your camera is just like on, dopamine high or something. You don't always want to do it. I like to think of spot metering more for those special cases where you have like one thing that's brighter that you want lit correctly, and then everything else is darker, or vice versa. Maybe you've got something that's dark and you want that to look really good, and then everything else around is way brighter, right? That's spot metering, but you don't want your camera to feel bipolar all the time. It's going to whiz back and forth between, high and low all the time. Where am I? Most of the time I'm actually in center weighted metering, right? That's just because what I take, right? I take photos, I take portraits, I take pictures of people, of things that there's one obvious middle subject. Now, that might not be you, right? I got some portfolios that were incredible, that were like landscapes and other things that most of the photos, I'm sure, because they never changed it, they didn't know better, were probably in matrix metering, evaluative metering, because the light basically didn't change from the center to the corners to the edges, right? It didn't matter that much. But for what I take, I'm focused mostly on the human element of it. So I'm mostly in center weighted because I have some obvious middle subject, right? Okay, here are some examples of when you would use spot metering, right? So whoever set this up, I love this. So here's an example of what spot metering could do. First off, they shot in evaluative metering. They shot in matrix metering if you're on a Nikon camera, right? So they had this kind of experiment. Same lighting every time, but they had a white plate, a gray plate, and a black plate. So remember, in evaluative metering, it's taking into account not only what your subject looks like and how bright the light is coming off your subject, but it's also taking into account the background. Why? Because evaluative metering meters for the corners, for the edges, right? So on a white plate, your camera would probably go, oh man, that's so bright, you got to turn that down, man, right? So then you've got super light, and as a good faithful camera operator that you are, you want to make your camera happy, right? So you get your meter right in the middle, okay? And then at f32, right, so a lot more closed down, right? The shutter speed stays the same in each one, but the aperture is what changes. So we're at f32. Now, the white plate turns kind of a gray. Well, your camera's happy about that, right? Because your camera's always trying to shoot for middle gray, right? It's always trying to shoot for that middle zone that's gray. So your camera is happy, but visually you can tell, oh yeah, that should be just a white plate, but it's not white. It's it's a gray. It's a middle gray because it had you turn down your settings to make the photo darker. Okay. Now this middle one, right? The gray plate, the plate is gray already. So from here to here, your camera's actually going, oh, JK, remember how I said that this was really bright? It's actually kind of right in the middle now. So yeah, do your thing to make it so that, the whole picture is gray. Well, all right, so, as a good faithful camera operator that you are, you change your settings so that your meter's right in the middle. We ended up at f16 for this one. And, you take your picture and the gray plate looks great and the fruit on the middle looks great too, because, look, we ended up with a, that middle gray plate already. So your camera's happy and you're happy too because you were hoping for a gray plate and you got it. Okay, so look at what evaluative metering did for this black plate too. Same lighting, same everything, except for the color of the plate changed. So from going from a white or a gray to a black plate, your camera's going, whoa, that is so dark. You got to open up, let more light in, man. So as a good faithful camera operator that you are, you're going to fix your meter so that your camera is letting in the right amount of light. In this case, we opened up to f8. And you took that picture, same lighting as this one, except now, because that aperture is more wide open, it pushed that black plate more to like a gray. And as a result, the food on the plate, the fruit kind of more looks like freeze-dried spaceman food. So that doesn't work, right? So basically the problem here is we're accounting for the background. There are sometimes you want to account for the background. And I'm not saying that's always the way it is. Sometimes you want to take into account the light coming off the background. But in this case, to really get your photo to look bright and vibrant and the way it should look, we can't take into account the background because it's going to get fooled by the super light on the white one or the super dark on the black one. In this case, let's switch our camera to spot metering. And all we're going to do is aim our camera just right at the fruit, take the average, take that meter reading straight from the middle zone, okay, and it's going to end up awesome. So here it is in spot metering, right? Your camera is less easily fooled because no matter what the background is, it's not taking an average from the background, so it doesn't care that it's light or gray or dark. All it cares about is the light coming off of this. Well, the light didn't change from one picture to the next. So from this one to this one to this one, the lighting is exactly the same. And look, our settings ended up being the same too, because we were faithfully following our meter and making the meter, exactly in the middle each time, right? So yeah, regardless of how bright or how dark the plate is or whatever the background is, okay, spot metering is not fooled by that because all it's focusing on is how bright or how dark that middle subject is. And like I said before, you can have that thing not be in the middle. If you want to push that off to the side, just aim over at whatever that thing is, get the settings right, and then come back over and compose your image. Okay, awesome. So that's a time when spot metering would be beneficial, right? Where there's a super light subject on a dark background, things like that. So like I said, exposure for cameras is determined by a meter calibrated for 18% gray. And you can actually get a gray card, right? This thing right here, this is a gray card. You can also get a gray card that has white, black, and middle gray in the middle. White, so you can get your white balance correct. Black, often for video, you can, on a professional video camera, you can set the black point so that the tones look really rich. And then the middle, of course, is middle gray. So you're averaging for middle gray. So if you just aim at a gray card, right, you zoom really close to whatever lighting situation it is, right onto that card, it's basically a cheat sheet. And all you have to do is just aim at that card and say, okay, I want this to be gray, right? This is true gray. And then you fix your settings to whatever that gray card is to be middle gray. And then no matter what you shoot, as long as your lighting doesn't change, those are the settings that you need to shoot for, right? So if you have access to one of these, or you wanted to get one, it's basically like a cheat sheet so that you end up with the exact right amount of light, no matter what's in the picture, whether it's background, foreground, whatever, it doesn't matter. You end up with just the perfect amount of light every time. So yeah, and they kind of fold up like one of those car sun visor things too, so they fit nicely into your camera bag. So this arrangement tends to work well under most conditions where the scene has a variety of tones and colors. The arrangement encounters difficulty, though, when the light and tonal ranges are extreme, right? You've got a high difference between the light and the dark, which we will see in just a sec. It's important to understand this concept and how it works so that you can intelligently compensate when you run into those adverse lighting conditions. So here's some adverse lighting conditions that your camera might get fooled on, right? So sometimes you might meter a subject against a bright background. Not that the person is in shadow, but just there's a lot of light reflecting off of that background. This is a waterfall in this case. And the person just kind of hanging out in shadow, right? So in evaluative metering or matrix metering, it would take an average of everything. The middle, okay, so the middle kind of brings down the average. This intense background, holy cow, that's way bright. And your camera would say, you got to bring up your average, right? So then you take it would want to compensate for it, so it would bring down the average. Okay, so you take that picture and overall it turns too dark. Well, why did it turn too dark? Because it was taking into account how intensely bright that background is. So instead, maybe let's switch it to center-weighted metering, right? This is kind of a designation for center-weighted metering. And you center-weighted meter for the middle subject. You don't have to zoom in. This photo is just showing you, yeah, this is the thing you point at. And it doesn't take into account as much of the reflective background. It does take some, because remember, it tapers off to the edges. So by the time you get to where the waterfall is, it's less taking that into account, more taking into account what's going on here. So going from evaluative metering, where the thing, the meter was right in the middle, Now that we're focused on kind of just that middle zone, your camera's going to go, oh, JK, remember how I said it was really bright, you had to turn it down? It's actually, you know, pretty good if all you're focusing on is just the light coming off of the subject. So you fix your light, you know, you probably open up your aperture or slow down your shutter speed, and then the light off of the subject looks awesome, but then the waterfall looks too bright. But is that okay? Yeah, that's okay, because our main focus is the subject, not the background. The background is secondary. So, you know, like what's most important, getting all of the light correct or getting that one subject to look awesome? Definitely get the subject looking awesome first, right? Even if that means that changes the background to be either too light or too dark, okay? That's the idea of changing your metering mode. All right, here's another one, a little more extreme example, this middle one. So in evaluative metering, it's tough to tell in this photo here, but this is actually a pretty dark photo. It's a dark photo of like a sunset, you know, an outdoor plein air painting class where they're, taking lessons or something. I don't know what they're doing. But it's actually fairly dark in this scene. So it doesn't quite make sense to show it this way because it's almost too bright. You know, a dark subject on an even darker background. So your photo or your camera in evaluative metering probably said, oh, that's way, way too dark. You got to tone it up. You know, so you probably open your aperture, close down your shutter speed or slow down your shutter speed, and then you end up with this super bright photo. Your camera's happy, right? Your camera's going, yeah, that's 18% gray, great job. But, you know, the way it looks on your, the way it looks visually doesn't feel like that actual scene. It's too bright, right? So instead, let's switch it over to spot metering. And in spot metering, okay, look at this. We just focus on that one middle subject. I'm not saying you have to zoom in. This is just, the photo is saying, yeah, you point at the most important thing, in this case, the subject, their face, okay? And notice it's not in the center. It's actually pushed off to the side. So they aimed over at the person, the most important thing, and they got their meter reading correct, all right? And then they pushed it back over and made their composition. And then because the subject is correct, it doesn't really matter what the background looks like. The background is actually really dark, but that actually kind of more tells you what the subject should have looked like and what the background should have looked like. It's more true to the tones that were actually there on the scene, right, in spot metering. In evaluative metering, it went way, way too bright. But your camera was happy. Now, think about this. In here, when you're aimed at that subject, you're making your camera happy, right? Going from this to, evaluative metering over to spot metering, you'll probably have to change your settings again. So while you're aimed over at that subject, you make your meter happy again. In this case, we probably sped up the shutter speed or closed down the aperture, okay, whatever had to happen so that the meter was right in the middle. And then coming from there over to this photo, okay, your spot meter may now be in the center again, and it's going, wait a minute, what are you doing? It was right in the middle, but now that you've recomposed, it's actually low again. So meter for the subject, right? Meter for the subject, get the camera happy, pointed at the subject, and then compose however you want to compose. And your subject's going to look awesome. No matter where your camera is pointed, if your subject's in that zone, it's going to look great. Your subject's going to look awesome. Okay, so the solution is not to meter for the extreme tones, right? The solution here is meter for the subject, meter for what's most important, not for the extremes, right? In the top one, the extreme was the background that was way too bright. In this one, the background was way too dark. Those are the extremes, right? So look, in this bottom one, we don't even change our metering mode. All we did was just aim at the right thing. Taking the picture at first, it takes into account how intensely bright this sky is, and then it says, whoa, you got to turn this down, right? So, mathematically, this is a good photo according to your meter, but the cityscape down below is is too dark. So instead, let's aim down at the cityscape, get the settings looking awesome, right? So the meter is right in the middle, your meter's happy, and then come back up and compose, right? And your settings are awesome because they're fixed onto whatever we measured over here. And then even though there's a bright, bright sky, yeah, it goes brighter, but at least the subject looks perfect, right? The subject looks awesome. So that's the trick there. And sometimes that's hard to do, right? It takes some practice. And that's actually something that I'm going to have you do for this metering project. I'm going to have you test out each of the settings in your metering modes, right? Some people will have, more metering modes. Some cameras might only have a couple of metering modes. Some might not have metering modes. So this is going to be variable. I do have sort of like an alternative built in to this assignment because I recognize that not everyone's camera has all the metering modes. A lot of them do. Most cameras do have the metering modes. You might have to dig through the settings, but you will find, no matter what camera you have, you can do this assignment, all right? So let's take a look at another difficult situation. Often low lighting is very challenging to take photos in, just because you don't have very much light to work with. So what would you do first, right? Think back to our talks on exposure. I'd probably hit, the ISO first, right? ISO is set it and forget it. So you set it to your lighting situation. In this case, your lighting is very low. So I might be in 1600, I might even be in 3200, just because there's not very much light to work with, okay? And then you might think, all right, well, what's the next thing I should do? Should I do the shutter speed, right? I don't know how slow the shutter speed is, but judging by the motion blur off of some of these things, I'd probably say that the motion is probably about a half second or a quarter second. And you end up with these wild blurs, but it's also like too bright. Like this isn't the lighting that was there. This more looks like the lighting that was actually there. This is like too bright. It almost looks like all the lights are on, but it's not. They just let the shutter open for a long, long time. Okay? So slowing down the shutter speed works to a point, but then it almost looks wrong. It looks fake, right? Like this is too bright. I don't want to turn the lights on. This is not with the lights on. This is just simply having a shutter speed that's way, way too slow. You might think, oh, I'm going to use a flash, right? You just pop the flash. Like I said, there are some times that you shouldn't pop the flash. There's some times when it's rude to pop the flash. You're at a party or something, you're going to make everyone mad if you use the flash. Or, often at sporting events or things like that, they say no flash photography. Well, then in that case, you just have to work with the lighting that you have. Sometimes that's a challenge, right? It's a real challenge to work with the lighting that you do have just because there's not very much light to work with. Okay? And you know what happens when you use a flash, right? You make everyone mad, but then also, skin tones will often get very washed out. You might get red eye. Red eye, remember, is the light bouncing off the subject's retinas into the light back into the lens. Or you might also get those ghosty shadows, right? This quartet is now a quintet with the ghost playing upright bass in the background. So that doesn't quite work either. How do you handle that one? I would probably be in either spot metering or center weighted metering and just focus on the one most important thing. It's probably these people's faces, the instruments, but notice how dark the instruments are. I might probably just focus on their faces. Get the lighting right for them. I do the ISO first, right, for the lighting situation. Because it's so low light, you're probably in 1600 or 3200. And then the next thing I do, before I sacrifice the shutter speed, I'd sacrifice the aperture first, right? What does it hurt to go? What does it hurt to go really, really low? You just drop it right there. Just put it in the hallway. Yeah. Thanks. Sorry, I had a visitor. It might make sense. It might make more sense. It might make more sense to open your aperture first before you sacrifice the shutter speed, right? Between the aperture and the shutter speed, which one should you hit first? Probably the aperture first, because I would want as much shutter speed as I could get away with, first. Anyway, so flash might not be it. It's just a delicate balance. It's a really delicate balance, and it might involve, changing your shutter speed, changing your aperture, changing your ISO according to this new meter. And maybe sometimes you just go against the best wishes of your meter, right? Your meter says, this is really underexposed. And you're like, don't worry about it. This is actually perfect, right? Visually, it's going to turn out great. So sometimes you are actually compensating for the fact that, I know you say it's too high or too low. It's actually just perfect right in the middle, right? Let's see. I think we get the idea. So I'm not going to, I'll talk about it, right? In evaluative metering, it's taking into account the light and the dark and everything. So instead, in spot metering, you aim just for that one thing that's most important. That looks awesome, and it doesn't care how light or how dark the background is, right? High contrast situations where you've got a whole lot of light, a whole lot of shadow, right? Aim for what's most important. Even if the background goes super bright or super dark, it doesn't matter, right? Okay, let's walk through it one more time, right? So let's say you're at a concert, right? You got a gig as a concert photographer, or you just, you love going to concerts, you want to take some awesome photos, you got front row seats. In evaluative metering, this photo would be a mess. I already know that it would not work out because we've got the dark background, and your camera would probably go, whoa, that's so dark, you got to turn it up, so it would want you to overcompensate for that and probably end up with a really, really light background or a really light subject, too bright. Well, that doesn't work, right? All we want to do is just get the lighting correct for that middle subject, right? Just getting the lighting correct for them. So first off, let's switch your camera over to spot metering. Now, I'm not saying spot metering is the end-all be-all. In fact, most of the time I'm in center-weighted metering. But in this case, you don't want to take into account any of the background. You just want to focus on that middle zone, that middle spot. So definitely spot metering is the one for us. Some cameras will have a dedicated button or dial. Some it's in the quick menus. On my cameras, if you have a camera, a Canon camera like mine, it's in the quick menus. So when you hit Q on the back, here, let's wake up my camera. You hit Q for quick menu, and then you jog over, it's on the bottom, and you just say right there, I have center weighted, spot metering, partial metering, but I'm not going to hold you accountable to that one, and then evaluative metering, right? And it's all just right there in a quick menu. There it is. On some Canon or some Nikon cameras, there's an I for info button. So you hit info, or it's just like a quick menu on the sidebars. You hit that I, and it will take you to those edge bars. One of those, I forget where it is because I don't have a Nikon camera, but I think it's on the side, and it will offer you, okay, here's the ISO, here's the white balance, boom, right there. There's the metering mode. So you can change your metering mode right there. Some cameras you have to just kind of dig through the menus to get to the metering modes. A lot of times point and shoot cameras, you'll click menu and it will open up that little sidebar, and one of them is the metering mode. Find out on your camera. Make sure your camera is nice and charged, and before you go out to shoot, go through the menus and see if you can find where your metering modes are. Okay. On this example right here, this is an old Nikon camera, and it does actually have its own dedicated switch, its own dial for the metering mode. So that's kind of cool. So now that we're in spot metering, let's aim at that most important thing, right? In this case, the subject is this rocker chick. I don't even know who it is. So they held their shutter button halfway down, and here are their settings, right? This is the settings. Maybe they took photos before the concert or something. They were outdoors waiting in line to buy tickets or something, right? And here's the settings they happen to use. Which of these would you hit first? Right? ISO, set it and forget it. Sorry, I just did that Dora the Explorer thing where I was waiting for an answer. Yeah, you do the ISO first, right? Set it and forget it, depending on the lighting situation. Now you might be tempted to say, oh, well, this is an adverse lighting condition. It's a special case, right? Where I need to boost the ISO high. You can actually probably get away with 800. I always like to think, if I can see it with the naked eye, I don't have to adjust my eyes, I see it really nicely, then you're probably good in 800 or less, okay? Special cases are for those times that your eyes had to adjust, right? It's the times that, in the auditorium with the lights down low or at night, things like that. So in this case, I would probably first switch it over to an ISO of 800. And look, we just went from, 2 stops underexposed to now only 1 stop underexposed. Awesome. So now which of these would you go to? Would you sacrifice the aperture first, or would you sacrifice the shutter speed? I would probably sacrifice the aperture first. What does it hurt if you get a wider aperture? If you get a shallower depth of field? Oh, well, that actually might be kind of cool, right? So you would sacrifice that one first. Well, think about it. What if you sacrificed your shutter speed first? You kept it at f8, fairly closed down, kind of middle ground, but then you went slower with the shutter speed. What would you get? You get a motion blur, right? So between a cool shallow depth of field or a motion blur, which variable would I rather sacrifice? Of course, right then I'd rather sacrifice the aperture, okay? So do the aperture first, or next, because we've already done the ISO. And I just cranked it as wide open as it would go. Well, this isn't my photo, but in our virtual, walking through this, f3.5. That's as wide as this camera would go. Cool. So f3.5, and then look how close we are. We were at 1 stop underexposed, and holy cow, look how close we are. If you were in a hurry and you just had to shoot and hope for the best, and then maybe fix it later. Maybe 1 little click underexposed isn't the end of the world. 1 little click under, you could fix that in Photoshop. You could fix that in Lightroom, especially if you shoot in RAW, right? I don't want to get on my soapbox about shooting in RAW again, but if you have access to shooting in RAW, shoot in RAW, and if it's 1 little click underexposed, it's not even a full stop underexposed, you can, increase the lighting just by a few cents, just like that, real easy. But let's say that we do have the time to kind of match the meter exactly. So 100 or 125. Say we want 1 more click to 100. All right, look, now the meter is exactly in the middle. And are we going to get motion blur off of 100? Maybe if there's big movements, but most of the time at 1/100th of a second, it's going to turn out great, nice and crisp. Okay, you do have to keep your hand steady. Like I said, anything lower than about 1/60th of a second, you're definitely going to get motion blur. So you want to avoid motion blur if that's not what you're going for. You want nice sharp images. But at 1/100th of a second, you've got a nice sharp image. So between those 3 variables, I think that looks awesome, right? Then you take the picture, you look at the back, and yeah, immediately from the histogram, you could tell, yeah, that's definitely going to be a high contrast, challenging photo. Anytime you have high contrast, there's a lot of dark, a lot of light. Remember, the dark is the shadow tones and the blacks on this side. What is that representative of? All the background stuff, right? And then the rocker chick and her guitar and stuff is all of this light on the right-hand side. Okay? So yeah, and hardly any gray tones in between. So you can tell, yeah, this is going to be a challenging photo to try and spot meter, or to try and meter for. So you have to be in spot metering, right? So that's how it's done. Now I want to take some time to go over the assignment, right? We're like an hour into this, so I want to kind of hurry through this part. But essentially, your metering project, when you get into Canvas, this is actually the metering project right here in Canvas. So this is actually the video that we are currently watching. If you wanted to watch it again, I very highly recommend kind of going through some of those things if you didn't quite understand any of these. So let me just read through it, right? The metering project. By now you should feel relatively comfortable with the settings of your camera, the aperture, the ISO, the shutter speed. Now you will use metering to take smarter photos, right? Take note of the exposure meter and what part of the image you're metering for. Because sometimes you're metering for the entire image, right? The top, the bottom, the middle, the sides, everything, the corners. But sometimes all you need is just metering for that middle zone, right? Sometimes that most important thing is what you need to meter for, that portrait or that person or that subject, whatever it is. And then it doesn't really matter if it's too light or too dark in the background, right? So, great example of when you would use one of the other metering modes. So, I put down here a reminder. Oh, by the way, I also said this. If you have a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, please set your camera to manual mode so you have full control over the shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO. If you have just a point-and-shoot camera, you are going to set to the different scene modes. Remember the portrait mode or landscape mode per each lighting situation. And actually down at the bottom, I have what to do if you don't have metering modes, because some point-and-shoots just don't have the metering modes. Okay, communicating with your camera and listening to it, right? We had a good talk while we were all together about how to remember if you had enough light coming in by reading your meter. So number one, press your shutter button halfway down and let your camera tell you how much light is coming in according to your current camera settings. It'll tell you if your current settings will be overexposed or underexposed. Even before you take the photo, it knows, yeah, this is about to be overexposed or underexposed. It's reading that 18% gray. And based on the reading that your camera gives you, determine if you need to change your aperture or your shutter speed. Make an educated guess and change the values on your camera and recheck your camera's reading, right? So it's that back and forth. You're having a conversation with your camera. You're reading it, you're coming back to it, let's read it again, fix it, read it again. You're just always kind of holding your shutter button halfway down, seeing what your camera says back. And remember, you can't aim your camera down to do that. You have to actually aim at the thing you're about to take a picture of and get the lighting correct for that, right? And you'll need to change the aperture and shutter speed for every new picture. You need to fix the aperture or the exposure every single time you take a picture, because the light's going to change every time you point at something new, right? So you're just constantly reading back and forth between you and that camera's meter. You're just reading the meter. What is your camera wanting to say? Okay. For this project, you're going to take 12 images. Essentially, that doesn't sound like a lot, and it's not. Essentially, I want to see that you know when you would change the metering modes, right? I want to know when you would change to evaluative metering. I want to see when you would change to center-weighted metering. I want to see those times that you would use spot metering. And we talked about it in the lecture. So rewind the lecture back to a couple slides ago when I first introduced it. I'll have the time code written in. But essentially, I want to see that you know when you would go to each of the metering modes. 3 different metering modes, 12 pictures, so I want 4 examples of each metering mode. That's it, right? I want to know 4 different times that you would go to matrix or evaluative metering. Here, let's go to it so you can see it. 4 different times, 4 different pictures that have an average amount of light everywhere. So the scene, basically, the foreground, the background, no matter where you are in the picture, it's about the same amount of light. There's not any intense shadow. There's not any intense light. That's a great time for you to be in evaluative metering or matrix metering, right? It comes by a couple different names. Funny story, if you go into Lightroom and you look into each of these as well, it will show you, yeah, you shot in pattern metering. It's like, what the heck's pattern metering? It's just another name for it. Every camera brand calls it something different. Okay, and then I want 4 examples of when you would shoot in center-weighted metering, right? 4 pictures where the center subject should be what gets metered. The measurement comes from that middle zone, not from everywhere, just from that one middle zone. And the light from the background doesn't matter as much. Okay, I think of center-weighted as portraits. Man, most of the time I'm in center-weighted because I take a lot of portraits. The most important thing is kind of that middle zone, and that's the one most important thing that you should be measuring for, right? So in this case, right, center-weighted metering, show me 4 examples of when you would shoot center-weighted, some portrait or some middle middle subject, right? And then I want 4 examples in spot metering. When would you shoot in spot metering? Show me 4 examples of when you would shoot spot metering. Anytime there's a high contrast, right? Meter for the subject, like a light subject on a dark background or a dark subject on a light background. I showed you those examples of, there's someone in shadow. Maybe they're in room light, but then there's a bright light out the window, okay? Or they're under a patio and they're in dark, but then there's a lot of light going on outside. Which do you meter for? Well, you meter for the subject, of course, but we don't want to take into account how intensely bright the background is. We just want to meter for that one spot. That's why it's called spot metering. Okay, so 4 high contrast photos where there's either like a light subject on a dark background, a dark subject on a light background, things like that. Okay. One of the things that I'm going to show you soon, we're not going to do it right now because I want you to just go out and take the pictures, but the naming convention is going to include what metering mode you were in. Now, if you don't know what metering mode you're in, you need to pay attention to what metering mode you're in. But in Lightroom, you will be, if you do use Lightroom, it's a little easier if you use Lightroom Classic for this. But if not, if you don't use Lightroom, because not everyone has Lightroom at home, I would like you just to remember which of the metering modes you were in, right? Oh, when I went and shot in my backyard, I was in evaluative metering. But then when I shot for my mom, I remember, that was the portrait. Oh, that was center weighted, right? So you kind of remember which is which, and then add that to the file name so that when you submit them to me, I can just look at it immediately and go, oh, these 4 are your evaluative metering, these 4 are your center weighted metering, these 4 are your spot metering, right? So I can just see all 12 and I know what metering mode you followed. If you are doing this in Lightroom, there's actually a preset that you can add in your export where you can just say right in the file name what metering mode you used. And that's actually in the file name template editor. So remember back in the composition project, boy, we're going back in time now, aren't we? In the composition project, we said edit. When you go to the export and you say, what does the file name look like? You say edit. That opens the file name template editor. You can actually, in one of those drop-down menus, insert the metering mode right into the file name. And I'll show you that in another stream. We'll do that in a little while. Take the photos first. That's why I'm just doing this part of the stream. But when you export, if you export out of Lightroom, you don't need to export out of Lightroom because not everyone has Lightroom. But when you export out of Lightroom, if you do, use the file name template editor to insert the metering mode right into your file name, right? Whether that's matrix, evaluative, pattern, yeah, like I said, it comes by a bunch of different names, or those 4 for center weighted, or those 4 for spot metering, right? So it's basically going to look like this. It's your class period. At this point, I don't really care if it has your class period in it. Definitely put your name and then metering for the metering project. And then because if you use that template editor, it will tell you just right in there whether you used center weighted or spot metering, that kind of thing. Now, if your camera doesn't have metering modes, I get that. Some people's cameras just don't have metering modes. Meter for the different parts of the image, right? So aim your camera at different areas of the scene, like a bright top corner or a darker middle area or a dark corner or something. Wherever you, say that this camera didn't have metering modes, right? You would aim at the middle, take the middle picture, aim at something darker, hold that down. While it's held down, go up to the middle again and then take that picture. And then aim at another one, right? So say there's something really bright up ahead. Okay, hold that down. While it's held down, change your composition. My finger's still held down. And then take that photo, right? So essentially you're taking the same photo but aiming at different things. This is only for people that don't have the metering modes. If you have the metering modes, do what I just said a couple minutes ago. But this is just for people that don't have metering modes. Most of us are going to have metering modes. Essentially, I want to show you, if you don't have metering modes, that you can kind of fake the metering modes. Even if you don't have manual mode, you can't change the aperture and stuff. You can aim at something darker, hold it down, and then move your composition up right? And then you are taking the meter reading from the darker thing and then pushing over to the light, or taking something from the light and holding the shutter button halfway down, moving down to wherever that subject is, and then taking that picture. Most of us, though, are going to have the metering modes, so I want you to shoot in the metering modes. Essentially, I'm just asking you for 4 different examples of each of the 3 metering modes. 3 times 4, that's 12 photos. Yeah, and this shouldn't be rocket science. They can be beautiful. You can edit these, you can make them awesome, but really, I just want to see that you understand the different times that you might change your metering modes, right? Evaluative metering or matrix metering for those kind of average scenes where it's not like super light or super dark someplace. It's really just kind of a middle zone that's a good amount of light, kind of just everywhere, middle reading, I should say. Then show me 4 different examples of when you'd shoot in center-weighted metering. Center-weighted is great for portraits. So show me 4 portraits or 4 middle obvious subjects. It doesn't matter how light or how dark the background is. Really, you're just focusing on that middle zone being the right amount of light. And then the last one is spot metering. Show me those 4 examples of like high contrast, like a light subject on a dark background or a dark subject on a light background. That's a great time to use spot metering. And you'll see as you aim for the subject, instead of averaging everything, you're just aiming for that subject to get your meter reading. The subject looks awesome, and then the background, whether it was lighter or darker, it doesn't matter. Maybe it was too light or too dark, but that middle zone looks perfect, right? So that's the project. That's the metering project. I've got it up here due on May 13th. But I recognize some people are kind of playing catch up. Some people don't have their colorized project in, so get that done first. Some people are still working on their portfolio. I'm so excited to keep seeing portfolios because the ones that I've seen already are just blowing my mind. The ones that I saw I was working through over the weekend. I'm just like, oh my gosh, you're getting it. You're getting it. Like it really was showing me who you are as a photographer. So I think that's super cool. Very powerful. You guys are awesome. I miss you. I wish we could see each other again before the end of the school year. I will be around, hopefully helping for like locker clean out and things for graduation and stuff. So if I do see you there, I know we can't like get close to each other, but you know, I'd love to see you and wave and stuff. Yeah. Anyway, so that's all I wanted to say today. I have been talking for an hour and a half. So if you've braved this entire lecture, good on you. You made it to the end. You can rewind through this and listen to it again if you're kind of confused on some things. I miss you. Hope to see you again soon. All right. Later.